The moment my father's ring finally cracked, I was 300 yards from a jackknifed fuel truck, snow slashing sideways into my face, screaming into a radio for a medevac bird that couldn't fly in this wind. I didn't know yet that my name was about to hit every television screen in the country. I didn't know that the man having Christmas dinner without me was about to see my face on the 6 o'clock news and drop a wine glass on his kitchen floor. All I knew in that instant was that a stranger's life was slipping through my hands and I was the only one who could stop it. 3 days before Christmas, my father called me at 1900 hours, right as I was locking up my office for the night. "Don't come this year," he said. "No hello, no warm-up, just that." I stood there holding the phone, my coat half on, and for a second I thought I'd misheard him. "Jason's going to be here," he continued like that explained everything. "Okay," I said slowly. "That's fine, Dad. I haven't seen Jason in a while. I don't want you making things awkward for him." I felt something in my chest go very still the way it does, right before a convoy hits an IED, that half second of silence before the world tells you it's about to hurt. Awkward, how, I asked, though some tired, resigned part of me already knew. He sighed the kind of sigh that meant he'd rehearsed this. Jason had just gotten married. His new in-laws were coming. Half the neighborhood was coming. My father didn't want anyone bringing up the army. Didn't want anyone asking me questions that might make Jason feel, in his words, overshadowed. He's finally settling down, Erica, building something. I don't want the attention pulled somewhere else, not this year. I've stood in rooms with generals. I've briefed colonels twice my age without my voice shaking. But something about my father's voice on the other end of that call made me 18 years old again, standing in the driveway with a duffel bag watching him shake Jason's hand at a graduation that wasn't even Jason's. "I understand," I said. That was it. No arguing. No asking him to reconsider. 18 years in this uniform teaches you which battles are worth fighting and which ones you walk away from with your dignity still intact. This was the second kind. I hung up, sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, and then did what I always do. I opened my laptop and canceled the flight. My team found out 2 days later when Sergeant Alvarez asked what time my plane left on the 23rd. I told her plans had changed. She didn't push "good soldiers know when a subject is closed," but she did corner me at the motor pool an hour after that and tell me I was welcome at her sister's place for dinner. No argument accepted. "I've got the duty roster to think about." I told her, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that half my unit had kids waiting for them at home. Spouses who'd spent a year alone while their soldiers were downrange parents counting the days until they could hug their children again. I didn't have anywhere urgent to be. So I volunteered to take the overnight shift on the 24th, freed up 2 junior soldiers to go be with their families, and told myself it didn't sting nearly as much as it did. Colorado in December doesn't ease you into winter. It hits you like a closed fist. By the afternoon of the 24th, the forecast had shifted from light snow to state of emergency in the span of about 6 hours, and by 1800 my unit had been activated to support state and county responders, working the interstate corridor. Visibility was dropping to almost nothing. Cars were sliding off the shoulder faster than tow trucks could reach them. I remember standing in the equipment bay, pulling on my cold weather gear, listening to the wind already howling against the hangar doors and feeling something settle in me that I can only describe as clarity. This I understood. This had rules, procedures, a chain of command, a purpose. Family apparently did not. I thought about my father's dining room table as I climbed into the truck. The good china would be out. The tablecloth my mother used to use before she passed, now repurposed for a family gathering I wasn't part of. Jason would be telling some a story about his promotion, and my father would be laughing in that warm, easy way he never quite managed with me anymore. I let myself feel that for exactly as long as it took to zip up my jacket. Then I put it away. The way you learn to put everything away when the mission requires your full attention and your personal life has to wait its turn. My radio crackled. Command wanted units staged along the interstate, within the hour reports of multiple vehicles down a passenger bus among them, visibility near zero. I climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, snow already collecting on my sleeves, my breath fogging in front of my face. Behind me in a warm house 40 minutes away, my father was raising a glass to a toast I wasn't there to hear. Ahead of me, the storm was waiting, and so though none of us knew it yet was every camera crew in the state. I checked my gear one last time, nodded to my driver, and we pulled out into the white. The storm didn't just arrive that night, it announced itself the way real disasters always do, with a violence that made the forecasters look almost cautious. By the time we reached mile marker 214, visibility was down to maybe 30 feet, and the wind was strong enough to rock the truck on its suspension. Command's radio traffic had gone from routine to urgent in a matter of minutes. A charter bus nearly 40 passengers had slid off the northbound shoulder and rolled onto its side. A pickup truck behind it had jackknifed, trying to avoid the wreck. There were reports of children on board the bus. There were reports worse of a fuel tanker stopped just uphill from the wreck, its driver unaccounted for. We were the first unit on scene. I don't remember making a conscious decision to take charge. It happened the way it always happens, muscle memory built over 18 years overriding whatever fear might otherwise have taken hold. I was out of the truck before it had fully stopped, boots sinking into 8 inches of fresh snow, shouting instructions over the wind. I split my small team into triage groups. I got Alvarez coordinating with the state troopers already scrambling to secure the scene. I got on the radio and started fighting for a medevac helicopter, even though every dispatcher I spoke to told me flight conditions were borderline impossible. "Then we work until they're possible," I said, and moved on to the next problem. The bus was the priority. Passengers were trapped at odd angles, a few with visible injuries, most just shaken and terrified, screaming for their kids in 3 different languages through the shattered windows. I climbed up onto the exposed side of the vehicle myself, snow stinging my face like static, and helped pass children down through the emergency exit one by one into waiting arms below. A boy, maybe 6 years old, wouldn't let go of my jacket sleeve even after I'd handed him down to a trooper. I remember crouching to his eye level for exactly 3 seconds, all the time I had, and telling him he was safe now that he'd done such a good job staying calm. Then I was back up, pulling the next passenger free. It was the fuel truck that nearly took everything sideways. The driver, an older man named Walt, was still inside his cab, disoriented, one leg pinned by a section of buckled dashboard. The tanker had begun to lean on the icy shoulder, and any spark, any impact, any shift in the wrong direction could have turned the whole scene into something none of us walked away from. My team lead recommended we wait for the hazmat unit. Protocol would have agreed with him. I didn't wait. I got a trooper to help me brace the cab door, told Alvarez to keep everyone else back 100 meters, and climbed up myself. Walt was in shock, breathing shallow blood on his forehead from where he'd hit the wheel. I talked to him the entire time I worked, his leg free. Asked him about his grandkids, learned he had 4. Learned the youngest had just started walking, anything to keep him present, keep him calm. Keep his breathing steady while the wind screamed around us, and I felt the ice under my boots shifting with every gust. When his leg came loose, I pulled him out over my shoulder, half carried, half dragged him 30 yards through snow that came up past my knees until we were both clear of the tanker, and I could finally let myself feel my hands shaking. I didn't know in that moment that a local news van had been parked at the edge of the scene since the bus rollover, its reporter and cameraman filming everything from a safe distance. The bus rescue, the fuel truck extraction, all of it in the harsh white glare of emergency lighting. I didn't think about cameras. I didn't think about anything except the next task, and the one after that, and the one after that, the way you do when the job in front of you is the only thing keeping you upright. By the time the medevac helicopter finally broke through a gap in the storm 2 hours later, we had stabilized every passenger from the bus, treated Walt for a fractured leg and mild hypothermia, and cleared the scene enough for tow trucks to begin the long process of hauling vehicles off the ice. I sat in the back of our truck afterward, peeling off gloves stiff with frozen sweat, and let myself exhale for the first time in what felt like hours. 40 miles away at my father's table, the evening had moved into dessert. I know this because Jason told me himself months later how he'd been holding court about his promotion, his new house, his plans for the spring, while my father beamed at him the way fathers are supposed to beam at their children. Nobody at that table said my name once. Nobody wondered where I was or what I might be doing on a night when half the state was under a storm warning. I wasn't a subject worth raising. I wasn't in that room a daughter at all, just an absence nobody had bothered to notice. I didn't know that yet, riding back to base with frost still clinging to my eyelashes. I only knew that we'd gotten everyone out alive, that Walt would see his grandkids again, that the little boy on the bus was already asleep in his mother's arms by the time I climbed down from the wreck. I thought that would be the end of it. Just another night, another mission, another quiet act nobody outside my unit would ever hear about. I had no idea the cameras had caught my face. I found out the way most people find out things about themselves anymore, secondhand, and far too late to have any say in it. We'd made it back to base a little after 2300, exhausted, soaked through despite the cold weather gear, running on adrenaline that was already starting to crash. I filed my after-action notes, checked on Walt's transport to the hospital, made sure every soldier under my command had eaten something and gotten dry clothes, and then finally sat down in the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee I didn't really want. Someone had the television on in the corner, tuned to a local station, the volume low. I wasn't even looking at it. Then Alvarez said my name in a strange voice and I looked up. There I was, on the screen, climbing the side of an overturned bus, snow whipping sideways across the frame, handing a child down into a trooper's arms. The chyron beneath the footage read, "Breaking Soldier Leads. Dramatic Highway Rescue During Record Blizzard." A local reporter's voice narrated over the clip, describing what she called one of the most extraordinary rescue efforts this region has seen in years. And then the footage cut to the fuel tanker. To me, pulling Walt free just before the truck's undercarriage buckled further under its own shifting weight. I sat there holding my coffee, feeling strangely detached from the person on the screen, like I was watching someone else's night unfold. Within 20 minutes, my phone started buzzing, first slowly, then constantly. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. An old high school friend. My commanding officer who simply texted, "Handle the press calls, however you want, Major. You earned that." I didn't know it yet, but 40 miles away my father's dinner had reached the coffee and pie stage when Jason, scrolling his phone at the table, went very quiet. He told me the rest of it later in pieces because for a long time neither of us wanted to relive it in full. He said he saw the headline first, a soldier's name he didn't recognize attached to a rescue video autoplaying in his feed, and scrolled past it without much thought. Then someone at the table turned on the television for the 10 o'clock broadcast, more out of holiday habit than anything else, and the same footage came up this time on the national feed, because by then 2 of the big networks had picked up the story. Jason said he sat up straight before he even understood why. Something about the walk, the voice giving orders through the wind, was too familiar to ignore. Then the camera caught my face clearly, snow-crusted along my collar, and he said her name out loud without meaning to. "Erica." The table went quiet. My father, according to Jason, actually laughed at first, a short, disbelieving sound, the kind you make when your brain hasn't caught up to what your eyes are telling you. Then the anchor said it, plainly reading straight off a teleprompter, "Major Erica Sullivan, an active-duty Army officer, is being credited with saving dozens of lives during last night's highway disaster." My father, Jason said, went pale in a way he'd never seen before. He stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped, and the wine glass in his hand slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Every face at that table was turned toward the television, watching footage of a woman none of them had thought to invite. He called me 11 minutes later. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of coordinating a statement with our public affairs office, trying to figure out how much I was obligated to say to reporters who'd started calling the base directly, but something made me pick up. "Sweetheart." His voice cracked on the single word. Why are you on the national news?" I could hear the television still going in the background of the call, hear voices I didn't recognize talking about me like I was a headline instead of a person. I thought about a dozen things I could have said. I thought about reminding him that 3 days ago he'd told me not to come home. I thought about asking whether he'd have found out I existed at all if a camera crew hadn't happened to be parked on that stretch of interstate. I didn't say any of it. I was doing my job, Dad. I told him, keeping my voice level, the same voice I use for briefings, for casualties, for anything that requires me not to fall apart in front of an audience. "I have to go. There's still work to finish here." I hung up before he could respond. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear about that even now. I hung up because I genuinely did have work to finish, soldiers to check on, a chain of command waiting on my report. But if I'm honest with myself, some small, tired part of me also wanted him to sit with that silence a little longer. Wanted him to feel just once what it was like to reach for me and find the line already gone quiet. Outside, the storm had finally started to break, the wind easing into something almost gentle. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the last of the snow drift down under the security lights, and thought about how strange it was that the whole country now knew my name, before my own father had thought to ask where I'd be spending Christmas. Behind me, my phone kept buzzing on the table. I let it. The story didn't fade the way I expected it to. I'd assumed, the way you do with most local news, that it would run for a day or two, and then get replaced by whatever came next, a different disaster, a different headline, the endless churn of the news cycle moving on to someone else's worst or best night. Instead, it grew. By the 26th, the footage had been picked up by 3 national networks. By the 27th, a wire service had run a longer piece, complete with interviews from passengers off that bus, people who wanted to put a name and a face to the officer who'd pulled them out of the wreckage. I turned down almost every interview request. Public Affairs handled most of it on my behalf, issuing a short statement crediting the whole team, the state troopers, the tow crews, the dispatchers who'd fought to get a helicopter through impossible conditions. I meant every word of it. None of what happened that night was a solo effort, and it felt wrong, genuinely wrong. Not just modest to let the story become about one person when a dozen people had worked through the same storm to get everyone out alive. But some things I couldn't turn away from. A woman named Deb Marchetti, whose 8-year-old daughter had been the little girl on the bus, tracked down the base's public information officer and asked gently if her daughter could send me something. A few days later, a hand-drawn card arrived at the unit mailroom, crayon on construction paper, a stick figure in a uniform standing next to a bus, "Thank you, Major Sullivan," written across the top in a careful, wobbly hand. I kept that card in my desk drawer. I still have it. Walt's family drove out to the base itself, all 4 grandkids in tow, the youngest, just barely walking like Walt had told me that night. His daughter cried when she shook my hand. Walt himself, legs still in a brace, mostly just gripped my forearm and said, "You didn't have to climb up there," to which I told him the honest truth that I hadn't thought about it as a choice at all. Some decisions don't feel like decisions in the moment. They just feel like the next necessary thing. Through all of it, my father kept calling. The first day I let it go to voicemail. The second day I read his texts without responding. "Can we talk? I'm so proud of you." I didn't know. I should have known. Each message landed somewhere in my chest I didn't particularly want to examine right then. I wasn't avoiding him out of spite. I was avoiding him because I genuinely didn't know what I would say, and 18 years in the Army has taught me not to open my mouth in a briefing until I actually have something worth saying. Jason texted too, which surprised me more than my father calling did. His message was shorter, and something about its plainness stuck with me longer than anything my father wrote. "I didn't know it was like this for you. I'm sorry, I mean that." I didn't respond right away, not because I wanted to punish him. Jason had never been cruel to me, not really. He'd simply spent years accepting the space he was given without asking many questions about why it existed or what it cost the person standing outside of it. There's a particular kind of quiet complicity, in that the kind that doesn't require malice to still leave scars. I think some part of him understood that now, watching the same footage everyone else had watched, seeing for the first time what just the Army had actually meant for the sister he'd shared a childhood with, and somewhere along the way stopped really knowing. I finished out that week the way I finish most weeks, checking on my soldiers, writing recommendations for 2 of them who deserved recognition for their work that night, following up on Walt's recovery, making sure the little girl's thank you card got a proper reply signed by the whole unit, not just me. Work has always been the thing that steadies me. When the rest of my life felt unresolved, undecided, sitting in some uncomfortable middle place I hadn't chosen, the job was still there, still clear, still exactly what it had always been. My father called a final time that Friday evening, and this time I picked up mostly because I was tired of watching my phone light up and doing nothing about it. "I don't expect you to fix this in one phone call," he said before I could say much of anything. His voice sounded different than it had on Christmas Eve, smaller, less certain of itself. "I just want to see you, in person, whenever you're ready." I told him I'd think about it. That was true. I wasn't ready to hand him forgiveness over the phone wrapped up neatly like it cost nothing. But I also wasn't the same person who'd quietly accepted "don't come this year" without so much as raising my voice. Something in me had shifted that night in the storm, some old, tired patience finally reaching its limit. I just didn't know yet how far my father was willing to go to find out what he'd actually missed. He showed up at the base gate on a Tuesday morning, no warning, no phone call ahead of time, which was so unlike him that the young private on duty called it in as a courtesy before letting him through the visitor checkpoint. I came out to meet him in my duty uniform halfway through a shift and found him standing near the flagpole looking smaller than I remembered, hands shoved in his coat pockets, eyes moving over the base like he was trying to memorize something he'd never bothered to look at before. I hadn't invited him. I hadn't told him where I worked exactly or what my days looked like because in 18 years he had never once asked. "I wanted to see it," he said before I could ask why he'd come. "Where you actually work, what it looks like." I gave him a short tour, mostly out of some instinct I couldn't quite name, not forgiveness, not yet, but something closer to letting a door stay open a crack instead of closing it entirely. We walked past the motor pool, the supply depot, the briefing room where I spend most of my mornings. Soldiers passed us in the hallway, and every single one of them straightened slightly and said some version of "Good morning, Major," out of habit more than performance. I watched my father notice that. Watched something shift in his face each time it happened, like he was recalculating something he'd taken for granted his whole life. We ended up in the break room, the same one where I'd first seen my own face on television 2 weeks earlier. Colonel Whitfield, my commanding officer, happened to be there getting coffee, and when he realized who my father was, he set his cup down and pulled up a chair without being asked. "You should know something about your daughter," he said in the plain, unhurried way career officers tend to talk. He told my father about the promotion I'd turned down 3 years earlier, a desk job in Washington, better pay, shorter hours. The kind of position most people would have taken without a second thought. I'd said no because it would have meant leaving my unit mid-deployment cycle, and I didn't believe in walking out on people halfway through something hard. He told him about the 2 times I'd delayed my own transition out of active duty to finish training replacements, extending my commitment when I didn't have to. He told him about the disaster relief rotations I'd volunteered for on my own time, including one Thanksgiving I'd spent distributing water in a flooded county instead of coming home. My father sat very still through all of it, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he never drank from. "I didn't know any of that," he said quietly once the colonel had excused himself, and it was just the 2 of us again. "You never asked," I said, not cruelly, just true. He nodded slow, like the words had weight he hadn't expected. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost like he was embarrassed to bring it up at all, he mentioned my birthday gifts, how every year for the past decade a card and something thoughtful had arrived at his house, and how he'd always assumed because Jason usually intercepted the mail and mentioned it first that the gifts had come from him. I went quiet for a moment, turning that over in my head. I hadn't realized he didn't know. I'd sent those packages every year without fail, a book he'd mentioned, wanting a bottle of the bourbon he liked, once a framed photograph from a trip we'd taken together before my mother passed, and I'd never once put a note inside claiming credit because that had never been the point. I'd simply wanted him to feel remembered. It never occurred to me that somewhere along the way, the credit had quietly shifted onto someone else, and that my father had spent 10 years being grateful to the wrong child. I looked at him and understood all at once that this wasn't really about the gifts. It was about how easily I could disappear inside my own family, even while actively, deliberately trying to stay present in it. Jason came by the base that same afternoon, having heard from my father that he was visiting. He found me alone near the vehicle bay and didn't waste time with small talk. "I knew," he said, "about the gifts. I knew they were from you, and I let him think they were from me. Every year. I never corrected it." He looked, for the first time since I'd known him as an adult, genuinely ashamed of himself. I don't have an excuse. I liked how it made him look at me. I didn't think about what it cost you. I didn't say anything for a moment. Some old defensive part of me wanted to let him sit in that guilt a while longer, the way I'd sat in the silence after every holiday I wasn't invited to. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last 2 weeks watching my father actually try clumsily and late to understand who I was, didn't have much appetite left for punishment. "Thank you for telling me," I said instead. "That's more than I expected." My father found us there a few minutes later, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the three of us stood in the same place without anyone performing anything. He didn't apologize right then. I think some part of him understood that apology needed more than a hallway and an audience. But when he finally did break down quietly, unexpectedly, right there near the trucks, his shoulders shaking in a way I genuinely never witnessed from him. Before I found I didn't have the urge to walk away. I just stood there and let him. He asked me to dinner a month later, and this time the invitation came with none of the usual conditions. "Just us," he said over the phone. "No relatives, no neighbors. I'm not even inviting Jason unless you want him there." I told him it could just be the two of us. Some conversations don't get easier with more people in the room, and I suspected this one was going to be hard enough as it was. He cooked, which surprised me. My father has never once in my entire adult life cooked a full meal from scratch. When I arrived, the kitchen smelled like the roast chicken my mother used to make, and for a moment, standing in the doorway, I felt something catch in my throat that had nothing to do with the storm or the news cameras or any of it. It was just the smell of a kitchen I hadn't really stood in years. We ate at the small table in the kitchen instead of the dining room where Christmas dinner had happened, which I think was deliberate. Neither of us mentioned it, but I noticed. He didn't wait long to say what he'd clearly been rehearsing. "I owe you an apology," he said, setting down his fork. Not the kind where I explain myself until it stops sounding like an apology, just, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." I waited. 18 years of debriefs have taught me the value of letting silence do some of the work. He told me about the years after he remarried, how he'd thrown himself into building a relationship with Jason, partly because he genuinely liked him, and partly he admitted because it felt like something he could still get right. His first marriage to my mother had ended in loss he never fully processed. He said that somewhere in trying to build something whole out of the pieces he had left, he'd stopped paying attention to the daughter who didn't need convincing to love him back. "I told myself you were fine," he said, "strong, self-sufficient, that you didn't need the same things Jason did." He shook his head slowly. I think it was easier to believe that than to admit I was choosing not to look. I thought about correcting him, about explaining that strength isn't the same as not needing anyone, that self-sufficiency is often just what happens when a person stops expecting help and starts building the capacity to survive without it. But I didn't say that. I don't think he needed a lecture. I think he needed for once to sit in the discomfort of his own honesty without me softening it for him. "The thing that hurt the most," I said instead, choosing my words the way I'd choose them in a briefing, deliberate and unhurried, "wasn't that you wanted Jason there and not me. Families make room for different people in different seasons. I could have understood that if that's all it was." He looked up at me, waiting. "It was that you thought I'd make things awkward, just by being there, just by being your daughter." My voice stayed even, but something in my chest had gone tight, saying it out loud finally after weeks of carrying it quietly. "You didn't say Jason needed space. You said I'd cause a problem. There's a difference." He didn't try to argue with that. I think if he had, I might have gotten up and left right then, dinner or no dinner. Instead, he just nodded slow and pained and said, "You're right. I don't have a way to make that not true. I can only tell you I understand it now and I didn't before." We sat with that for a while. The chicken went cold between us, and neither of us seemed to care. Eventually, he asked about the war, about the deployments, about things he'd never once asked me in 18 years of service, not out of performance I could tell, but because he genuinely wanted to know. Now, in the same way, you finally read a book everyone's been telling you to read for a decade. I told him some of it, not all of it. Some things I've never told anyone outside my unit, and I wasn't ready to hand those over that night either. Before I left, he walked me to my car, hands in his coat pockets against the cold, and said one more thing. "I don't expect this fixes anything overnight. I know that's not how this works." "No," I agreed, "it's not. But I'd like the chance to keep trying, if you'll let me." I looked at him for a long moment, my father standing in his driveway in the same cold he'd once told me not to bring myself home into, finally asking instead of assuming. "Okay," I said, "we can try." It wasn't forgiveness. Not fully, not yet. But it was the first honest conversation we'd had in longer than either of us wanted to admit. And driving back to base that night, I found myself thinking that maybe that was enough of a start. A year moves faster than you expect it to, especially when you spend most of it rebuilding something you thought was already lost. My father and I didn't fix everything in that one dinner, and I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this get told too neatly sometimes, like an apology is a light switch instead of a long, unglamorous process. There were awkward phone calls in the months that followed. There were moments where old habits crept back in him, forgetting to ask about my work, me forgetting to give him the chance to ask. But there were also Sunday calls that became a habit instead of an obligation, a visit for my promotion ceremony, where he sat in the front row and didn't once mention Jason's name, and slowly, carefully the outline of an actual relationship where there had only been distance before. So when December came around again, I wasn't entirely surprised when my father showed up at the base gate a second time. What surprised me was that he came without calling ahead on Christmas Eve itself, and waited outside the visitor checkpoint for nearly 40 minutes until my shift ended, standing in the cold in a coat that wasn't warm enough for Colorado in December, exactly like a man learning a year too late what it might have felt like to be waited for. "I didn't want you spending tonight wondering if I'd remember," he said, when I finally walked out and found him there. He handed me a small box, wrapped simply, no ribbon, nothing performative about it. Inside was an old photograph, the two of us, decades younger, standing in front of the recruiting office the day I signed my enlistment papers. I remembered that day. I remembered how nervous I'd been, and how at the time I hadn't been entirely sure he was proud of the choice I was making. Looking at the photo now, I could see it in his face even then, something he apparently hadn't known how to say out loud back then and had spent a year learning how to. On the back in his handwriting he'd written, "You have always been my pride." It just took me too many years to find the courage to say it. I stood there in the cold for a long moment holding that photograph and didn't trust myself to say much of anything. Jason arrived a few minutes later, having driven up separately, which told me my father had planned this more carefully than he was letting on. Jason didn't ask for forgiveness. He'd apparently learned over the past year that forgiveness isn't something you can request on a schedule that's convenient for you. He just thanked me, quietly, without performance, the way an honest apology usually sounds. "You never once made me feel guilty," he said. "Even when you had every right to. I don't think I ever thanked you for that." I told him he didn't owe me a debt for simply not being cruel to him. But I understood what he meant, and I let the moment sit there between us without rushing past it the way I've learned not to rush past the things that actually matter. We ended up, the three of us, at the Veterans Support Center downtown that night, carrying trays of food into a hall full of people who, for one reason or another, didn't have anywhere else to be on Christmas Eve. My father hadn't asked to come along. He'd simply shown up in old work clothes, ready to carry boxes, and I found I didn't have it in me to turn him away. We spent the evening serving dinner, refilling coffee, sitting with veterans who told stories nobody else had asked to hear in a long time. My father listened to every one of them like it mattered, and I think watching him, that something in me finally settled. Not because the past had been erased, but because the present had become something worth trusting. Late that night, walking back to the car through a light snow that felt nothing like the storm from a year before, I thought about how strange it was that the worst Christmas of my life had somehow led me here. A year ago, my father told me not to come home because he was afraid I'd make someone else feel small. Tonight he stood in the cold on Christmas Eve just to make sure I never felt forgotten again. I used to think the hardest missions were the ones with sirens and stretchers and lives hanging in the balance out on some icy highway. I don't think that anymore. I think the hardest mission any of us ever faces is finding our way back to the people we love, especially when they've made that path harder than it needed to be. That night in the storm, I thought I was just doing my job. It turns out I was also finding my way back to my own family. I just didn't know it yet. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear where it found you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know what part stayed with you the longest. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, so if you don't want to miss what's coming next, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep this journey going together.